Why? What are you doing here?
So here in this picture, I am competing in the national championship in Kansas City, and that device is my custom brewer I use for that competition. Uh, I had this strange idea where I almost wanted an anti-brewer, which sounds weird, but I wanted to almost take the brewer out of the equation entirely and rely heavily on my own pours and what how I interact with the coffee. I also wanted it to be very fast. So basically, I wanted to have a filter and coffee elevated in thin air and nothing else. And I wanted to brew out of it, but clearly that's impossible. So I didn't want any brewer to have any influence on my coffee. I wanted to do my own thing with the coffee. I don't want any restrictive angles. I wanted it to be filtered, want hot water. So I tried making something that had a like very little influence on the brew. So this brewer is only there for heat insulation and filter support. It doesn't really do anything other than that, which is nice. So it is extremely fast, which is awesome. The faster the brewer, like the easier the flow rate, the finer I can grind. And when you grind finer, you get a more narrow particle distribution, which means more even particles. And when you have more closely sized particles, you usually can get more of a balanced cup, a little bit more flavor clarity while still maintaining complexity.
I also noticed that it's somewhat of a flat bottom, which gives you a lot of extraction surface, right? Rather than a cone, where perhaps maybe a cone would cause a little bit more restriction or compaction or flow rate issues. Because with really finely ground coffee, you're going to find maybe like some flow rate issues. And then, how many of these do you have? Are they like in production yet? I'm sure you get that question a lot, so I thought I'd ask it.
I get that question all the time
Right.
still for almost 2 years now.
So heads up,
Um,
here's your refresher. We're gonna
yeah.
put this out there. Is
It was in production with a local company in Kansas City, but that kind of fell through due to it just being a small company and not able to manufacture these. Like ceramic is honestly pretty pricey, so it didn't ultimately work out. And then the pandemic hit, which halted any additional conversations I had with some other companies about producing it.
right.
So, as far as what is in existence, I think maybe four of them are in existence, maybe
Oh
five.
wow, wow.
Yes.
That just put the price up really high.
Yeah. To put it into perspective, it is so fast that I grind it just a touch finer than you would an AeroPress to make an espresso. On a 1 to 16 scale on, say, an EK43, I grind on like a 5 or 6. Whereas V60, sometimes it's like 9 to 10.
With this brewer, then there has to be a filter medium. What did you use for that?
I use the Kalita filter because it is flat bottom and it molds to the brewer really well. So it kept that flat bottom. And I used the pack that has the blue lettering on it. They're a little bit thinner than the black packs. So they're super, super thin, which again helps with the flow rate.
I think that you had something to do with this too, right?
So it's a bunch of really, really tiny holes, clearly, but they're angled in a way that when the stream comes down, it swirls together and it holds like yeah, it vortexes and um, it holds heat really well, but it's also extremely fast, similar to my brewer. So yeah, it
And
makes it's a swirling effect. Literally after I did my round with my brewer, I had two men come up to me in suits with business cards, and they're like, "Hey, we're with this company out of Vancouver, Espro. We want to build your brewer. Call us." And I was like, "Okay." I just competed, so I was like, "All right, yeah, I'll give them a call." Um, and then later on, they wanted to make a brewer that had elements of the brewer I designed, but without obviously being the same brewer. But they were like, "This is largely inspired by what you did. Like, we want you to collaborate with us on it."
what kind of like coffee to water ratio did you use, and because of the faster extraction?
Honestly, it still brews very similarly to a normal flat bottom brewer. I think, like I said, the biggest change was the grind size, but my ratio still was around a 1 to 15 or 1 to 14, like pretty standard. And my brew time was actually pushing around 3 minutes. I think that is also largely coffee dependent. So it really just depends on the coffee. Um, in my experience, ratio is that's what it is. It's age of the coffee, how the coffee is tasting.
Like what the coffee is made of really depends on how it's going to be extracted at the end of the day. As far as like also you said freshness, right? But the freshness of the green coffee is another attribute, right? And then you have the roast level, um, and then roasted coffee freshness. I think you mentioned that. Proportion ratio, we talked about that. We talked about grind size, distribution, time, temperature, water, turbulence, pressure, extraction method, and filter medium. Am I missing anything? That's what I really did. I was like, I just ran out of like slide space, but I'm kind of curious. Is there, are these all of the things that you think about before you brew coffee, or how do you tell someone this is a good way to brew coffee and not tell them all this?
Being a barista or a barista trainer, I don't, roast or green buy or anything. So typically my focus is post roast and like how fresh it is and how what the roast level is. So I start there. Usually for darker roasts, it will likely be a different ratio than I would a lighter coffee. Same with different processes and how fresh or how old the coffee is. Those are the things I like to talk to people the most about. Like this coffee is 2 weeks off the roast. You might actually need to use a little more coffee to brew it. Um, and opposite end there, like this coffee is really fresh. We might need to use a little less coffee.
It could be kind of fun to talk about roast level and extraction and what's the difference between a light roast and a dark roast.
Picture the amount of coffee you have as work for the water to do. So you have X amount of water, this big of a pile of work, and like this big of a pile of work over the same amount of time. The water is able to get through more of the smaller pile over the same amount of time than the larger pile. It's kind of hover in the middle. So when you have a dark roast coffee, all coffee actually extracts in 3 phases. The first phase, you get brightness or acidity. The middle phase is where you start getting sweetness. And the third phase is where you start getting the bitterness. And you need all three to achieve a balanced cup. You want equal parts sweetness, acidity, or brightness, as we like to call it, and bitterness. With a dark roast, you already are going to get those heavily sweet notes and bitters. So you're already going to have a good chunk of that last part of it. So by using more coffee for a dark roast, so let's say 27 grams in versus like 24 for like a pour over with 350 grams of water, you're actually giving the water more work to do, and you're going to let that extraction hover just in that sweetness range, because we know the coffee's bitterness is super easy to extract. So we're going to try to keep that extraction in the first 2 phases to limit any additional bitterness. On the opposite end, light roasts, or say you have a coffee that you know is going to be very fruity, very bright, and very acidic. You know you're going to get that out of there, but you need to push it to get the sweetness and the bitter in order to balance out the acidity. So sometimes you want to start on a little lower dose and a wider ratio, so that way you can push that extraction more into the sweetness and bitterness phase, to get those notes out of there again to balance out the acidity.
Well, so in the background, we've got full immersion, and then we've got pour over, which is like pass through. And you're talking about coffee or hot water going over rapidly, consistently going over these particles versus full immersion, completely suspended in boiling water for a long period of time. What's the difference? What's the result of those two different methods?
Well, fresh water is more has more extractability than concentrated water. When you're doing an immersion like a French press, your extraction is actually kind of slowed down a bit because that water is becoming concentrated. It's not a constant reintroduction of fresh water, which is again, it's able to extract really well. Whereas water that it already has a little bit of a concentration of coffee it isn't as great at extracting things. So it actually slows it down a bit, which is why if you're using a French press, darker roasts are actually like pretty ideal because again, that's keeping that extraction out of the super bitter phase and kind of keeping it right in the middle in the sweet spot, literally, where you want to keep it. Yeah, basically it just comes down to like the concentration of the water, which is why you want really high quality, like pure water, especially when you're brewing coffee, because you want that to be optimal for extraction.
Right, water is a an absorber, and the more stuff it has absorbed, the slower it absorbs later. So if it's already got coffee stuff in it, it's not going to extract as
That's what
much
I feel
coffee
about
stuff.
life sometimes, Marty. Like, just absorb so much, just starting to slow down. You're just like, you know what? I don't want any more, like fresh water. I'm good.
I'm too concentrated.
I don't want to be poured over anymore. Just, asking, how do you repeat a brew recipe that you like?
I usually write it down. I think the numbers are the easy part. You can say this is your ratio, this is the type of coffee you use, this is the brewer. Um, it gets a little bit tricky when you talk about agitation, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. Um, and saying high agitation in the beginning, middle, medium agitation, and however you do it. But to each person, that could be very different. High agitation of someone could be just stirring it like vigorously or just pouring really high or not, or they just think high agitation is just tiny bit of agitation. So I think that's the hardest thing to convey, like what is high agitation,
Day, but also I just want to mention the Pantone 2021. These are the colors, gray and yellow. I don't know how I feel about that, but